Sorry, I'm having some technological difficulties here. Can you hear me? And am I sharing let's see. There we go. Hopefully that works. All right, sorry about that. All right, thank you, Torben, and also Marianne and Dirk for this opportunity to present. So today, I'm going to share ongoing research on work in the age of automation. And this is a topic of great concern for economic development planners and also the regions that they seek to support. So since the Great Recession, there's been a lot of media attention on job displacement from automation and technology adoption. And this has policymakers and also practitioners scrambling for solutions to offset this job loss. This is not a new policy concern, obviously, but its contemporary iteration got a kickstart in 2013 with a high-profile working paper by Osborne and Frey, and their predictive model indicated there would be widespread job displacement in coming decades, with close to 50% of this nation's current jobs projected to become permanently obsolete. Mary mentioned some of this work, and it's been very influential in our thinking. But that high estimate has also been questioned. Two OECD reports have actually downgraded that number to around 10% for the United States. But that's still significant. Even at 10%, millions of working Americans would be permanently booted from the labor market. And for the state where I live, North Carolina, that translates into hundreds of thousands of jobs. The pandemic has obviously broadened the focus of job loss far beyond technological displacement. So we can't just only focus on these technological effects. But still, there are claims that technological adoption could be expedited in response to this pandemic. And we're already seeing evidence that some large manufacturers and firms in the United States are quickly moving in this direction. So they're rushing their automation decisions in ways that will have devastating and far-reaching labor market effects. So we're less than 1 week away from the most consequential US presidential election in modern history. And I thought I would give us a little break from some of that intense pressure that we're all feeling right now. I thought I would take us back down memory lane to last year's presidential primary. So back then there was still heated debate around automation, and a number of the candidates did weigh in. Some of you may remember the candidate Bernie Sanders. Well, the moderator during the October 2019 debate asked him about this proposal for a federal jobs guarantee, and specifically the suggestion that we hire people who lose their jobs from automation to upgrade our nation's failing infrastructure and transition our economy to clean technology and more environmentally friendly production processes. So this is what labor advocates and unions call the just transition, which is very much centered or the central part of that Green New Deal framework that we've also heard about. Well, another Democratic presidential hopeful, this one, the tech entrepreneur, Andrew Yang, he was not buying it. So he pushed a very different solution. And it's important to note this is one that other Silicon Valley technologists have been especially excited to promote. This is the idea of the UBI, the Universal Basic Income. So giving everybody, and it's not just the poor, a guaranteed monthly stipend, a freedom dividend. So people are not limited to working for the federal government, but instead can focus on activities that they find more meaningful, more satisfying. As he put it, a positive vision in response to the fourth industrial revolution. So a revolution not of people, but of machinery. And this basic income, it would be paid for with a robot tax, so a tax on automation. Presented side by side, these solutions do look quite different. You've got one pushing that federal job creation program, the other federal payments to free individuals from the drudgery of work. But as we scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot more in common here. And it's the assumption that technology is progressing in ways that will upend work. And it is this shared assumption that I want to challenge today. And by drawing attention to an alternative set of institutional solutions that are being adopted at the subnational and regional levels. So to set the stage, I want to share a few vignettes of innovative startup companies in the robotics and automation space. So the first is called Starsky Robotics. So for the Gen Xers on the Zoom call today, this may be a familiar name. It's the main character in a popular TV show from the 1970s about a cop duo. But actually, it's CB radio slang for truck drivers that work together in teams. So this young San Francisco-based company, it's tried to go head-to-head with Tesla and Uber in developing self-driving vehicles, but they stand apart from their competitors because they're hiring experienced commercial truck drivers. They're pairing those drivers with AI or artificial intelligence experts to develop the driverless technology, but equally important to co-design a new physical infrastructure with the hope of giving those truck drivers the opportunity to remain close to, quote, home and family by controlling large fleets of vehicles from remote location sites. All right, the second example, Factory OS is an off-site. This is a state-of-the-art prefab construction facility that combines robotics technology, in-house research and development, and tried and true manufacturing methods to build modular, multifamily housing at much lower cost. Factory OS is housed in a massive World War II shipbuilding facility in Northern California in the city of Vallejo. And while the company retains close links to Silicon Valley investors and also housing hungry tech giants, including Google, what stands out here is the formal connections with carpentry and building trades unions. So these are unions that are feeding that factory workforce, and they're also essential institutional advocates for promoting this technology as a solution to the Bay Area's urban housing crisis. The final company I want to introduce you to is called 99 Degrees Custom. This is a cutting-edge fiber technology firm based in Lawrence, Massachusetts. For the history buffs, this is in a region that is considered the birthplace of American textile manufacturing. So this company hires and cross-trains experienced apparel workers from the region. And most of these workers are Latinx and South Asian immigrants. They're tapping that legacy talent pool to develop high performance fabrics and wearable technologies. And they're partnering with local universities. And that includes MIT, which is a few miles down the road in Cambridge, Massachusetts. MIT is providing them with seed funding and ongoing technical assistance in support of the underlying business and technology model. So why am I sharing these business cases? I'm a planning scholar. I am not a professor at our business school, and this is a workshop on regional inequality, not business strategy or entrepreneurship. I'm sharing them because these cases not only challenge the dominant narrative around automation and employment, they also highlight opportunities for coordinated institutional strategies that align economic innovation, economic opportunity. They illustrate that innovation can be inclusive of blue-collar workers and with less educated workers placed on equal footing with highly educated technology experts. In other words, they're really pushing and expanding what we typically mean by the knowledge workforce. They also prove automation does not have to be job ending. It can be opportunity broadening. And this is a far cry from Silicon Valley's push for that universal basic income or the close cousin, the robot tax, which, as I noted earlier, assume technological progress that destroys jobs and livelihoods is inevitable. But we also see with these cases the makings of what I call an inclusive innovation standard. And we heard that term yesterday from Neil. But here with these cases, it's reinforced by institutions that share a moral sensibility to harness and protect the creative talents of frontline workers. And knowing this means that as scholars, we should also think in broader institutional terms, asking more from institutions for sure, but also asking how more institutions that care about the fate of less educated and vulnerable workers can expand their influence over technology development and decision making in ways that protects and promotes frontline workers and their jobs. So with that in mind, I've spent some time digging into modern day and historic cases where institutional actors shape and reshape technology development and deployment. And I have a growing list of examples, but what I want to do with my remaining time is to share 4 cross-cutting strategies that are in play in many of these cases and that speak to a very different future of work. The first strategy I'm observing in these cases involves institutions intentionally slowing the pace of technological adoption. So they're using that breathing room to devise worker-friendly solutions. One of my favorite examples here is the mechanization and modernization deal struck between a labor union and shipping companies in the late 1950s, when shipping containers were first introduced in this country. Before containerization, port workers supported what was called a breaking bulk system. So they would manually unpack and repack cargo. They used a labor-intensive process that was very much the same in 1950 as it had been at the beginning of the Victorian age. Containerization changed that in ways that was perceived as radical and disruptive as driverless vehicles are today. With this technological shift, goods would now arrive in the prepackaged metal container. They were moved through a series of cranes from ship to truck to train, so no longer by men and muscle. And the idea to use containers was first proposed by a trucking entrepreneur here in the state of North Carolina. He sought an effective means to integrate shipping, long-haul trucking, and the change he would introduce here would eventually become the catalyst for global trade. But in the 1950s, the more immediate and pressing concern was the impact on labor demand. So a man named Harry Bridges, the president of the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union, he stepped in as a critical actor in shaping labor's response. He actually pushed his members on the West Coast of the United States not to resist the introduction of containers, but only in exchange for a steady-paced phase-in of this technology by the ports that would stretch out over the course of a decade. By prolonging the time frame, that union could ease some workers out of their current jobs, but it could help many others move into new jobs that were being created through technological change. A more recent example of this technology pacing strategy is led by a labor union in Las Vegas, this one representing 57,000 workers in the city's casino and hospitality industry. This union and the Vegas casinos approved a historic collective bargaining agreement 2 years ago, requiring the casinos to give at least 6 months advance notice of new technology implementation. This early warning allowed the union to determine whether workers are at risk of long-term job displacement and then develop lateral pathways, or for those of us who study workforce development, career lattices, in order to move vulnerable workers into more secure occupational areas. And what's really interesting is that the Marriott hotel chain, they recently signed a similar nationwide collective bargaining agreement modeled on this Vegas case. So it suggests there is room to expand this further. A second related strategy, the institutional actors here promote high quality vocational training, but this is not displaced worker retraining for jobs in some other sector. It's training to enhance employer commitments to job mobility for incumbent workers within the same organizational and industry setting. So let's go back to the 50s again. The Port Modernization Agreement actually parsed workers by seniority, and it gave those on track to retire by the late 1960s much better pensions and more generous phase-out pay. But more than the social safety net, it established a robust training fund to ensure port workers had lucrative career options in logistics management and port technology. Today, the Culinary Union in Vegas, they manage a similar multi-million-dollar training fund, which again facilitates that transition to high-growth occupational areas. Third strategy, these institutions empower workers by flipping the standard occupational hierarchy so that workers that are at the bottom, that would normally be at high risk of further marginalization from widespread change, are instead repositioned as the technology guiding experts. In Vegas, the Culinary Union administers an annual technology needs survey now. It actually asks those 57,000 members to identify real problems that need a technology fix. The first survey, housekeepers noted they wanted automated carts. They wanted something to help reduce the risk of physical injury because those carts are often overloaded, especially at the start of their shift, with cleaning equipment and heavy supplies. Women workers, they asked for GPS-enabled panic buttons that they could attach or get embedded into the uniform in order to protect against physical or sexual assault. So with this survey, the union is not leaving technology choice to some remote or distant tech company, some entrepreneur that has little connection to this region or with limited knowledge to existing working conditions and challenges. Rather, they're positioning frontline workers as domain experts. They're giving workers the power, the voice to influence technology market development and guide innovations in support of job enhancing solutions. And this means they're bringing to light actual work-based problems that can also affect the company bottom line, and with it, the ability to nurture and retain a workforce. A related example involves a state-funded advanced technology center, this one in upstate New York. And here, that center worked with a small manufacturing firm to co-design a novel robotics application. But in this case, their design partners were not the industrial engineers, it was the frontline manufacturing workforce. The result, a cobot. This is a collaborative robot that embeds within existing production teams. It's actually now the sixth member of the team, handling more repetitive tasks, which are frustrating to do by human hand, but can also slow the pace of production. The idea for involving frontline workers initially came from the company owners, but this state-funded technology center is now positioned to advocate for participatory design principles as it supports and engages other small and medium-sized firms in the region. The fourth and final strategy. These institutions leverage deep pocket funding for regional infrastructure, including clean infrastructure. They're ensuring public funds are not encouraging job displacement, but rather mandate worker protections through formal contracts that are secured through a reinforcing web of workforce and local hiring agreements. One of my favorite examples here is called the Jobs to Move America Coalition, and they recently partnered with planning agencies in big cities like Los Angeles and Chicago, also Seattle, to ensure that these large-scale, publicly funded transportation projects create career-enhancing opportunities for low-income residents. The coalition initially worked with the Obama administration in order to pre-approve what is called the U.S. Employment Plan, with the effort to use that to support inclusionary procurement practices. So the adoption of that employment plan by the city of Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, it meant that labor advocates could extend job access commitments across the entire transit supply chain. So requiring clean tech manufacturers of electric buses and trains to locate production facilities in Southern California and then adhere to local hiring systems to guarantee family sustaining jobs for workers most in need. In Chicago, this same plug and play employment plan, it enabled community labor coalitions to form in order to secure a commitment for 400 good paying jobs when the city decided to extend their subway system, and also ensuring those jobs were inclusive of low income workers of color and gave them access to career enhancing apprenticeship and work-based learning opportunities. So to conclude, these cross-cutting strategies show that when it comes to large-scale technological change, progressive institutions can act as critical gatekeepers, getting in front of technological development to ensure innovation and equity goals are closely aligned from the start. And this is not just driven by labor unions, which, while growing back slowly, still represent a small slice of the US workforce. Beyond these unions, we see active involvement by government-backed research and technology centers, by public transportation authorities, by planning agencies, and also technology leading universities. I mentioned MIT at the start, but there are others that are working to extend this institutional footprint. But could these hyper-local cases also suggest a promising direction for federal and state policy in support of innovation and workforce development? Yes, I believe so. And it is here where I think we can borrow lessons from European and Asian nations and regions. There have been recent reports that indicate their investments in innovative capacity, including technological upgrading, have generated a sizable manufacturing employment boost. How? With coordinated institutional supports that concurrently advance innovation, business management, and workforce development. And not just through investments in quality public education, but through concurrent strategies of employer engagement that extend job quality commitments and work-based learning supports across the entire educational spectrum. And this finding that technological innovation, including forms of automation, could create a positive feedback loop for employment growth speaks to an additional institutional opportunity for researchers to increase public awareness of dramatically different business models, even within narrowly prescribed technological areas. So shedding greater light on the variety of strategies that institutions are devising to gain influence over technological choices through decisive, targeted, and coordinated actions that determine which technologies get adopted at which point in time and with which economic and social interests in mind. So what I've shared today comes from the final exploratory chapter of my forthcoming book with MIT press. And admittedly, I do call this my sci-fi chapter. These cases all predate the current pandemic as well. And so as I move forward with this research project, I would very much welcome ideas for other examples that I could explore nationally.
But let's skip this, maybe this question to the end of our session. And maybe there are short questions from the audience, and I will ask them. Yeah, there's one question. Nicola, thank you. Can you share how you think these examples can be best be scaled?
Yes, Sarah, thank you for that great question. So I think that one important way that I've been looking at is by embedding workforce within more traditional economic development systems. So one that I've been looking at, especially in the context of US manufacturing, is called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership. And this is a network that reaches across the nation. There are 51 centers, one in every state plus Puerto Rico. And on an annual basis, they serve roughly 30,000 small and medium manufacturing firms. And their work last year helped to retain or create 300,000 manufacturing jobs in this country. So I feel like we can be pushing these kinds of decisions within that system. And there are a number of these centers that are starting to really experiment on the workforce side. I've done some evaluation work on the one in Illinois that showed very promising results. And I think if we can use those systems, build as well on the investments in what are called the Manufacturing USA institutes that the Obama administration created, but that Trump has continued to fund. That's another part of this mainstream sort of innovation economic development space. Jennifer has done work on these manufacturing institutes and recognizes that they're underutilized when it comes to some of these equity and inclusion concerns, including how we engage.
Is low, that contributes, but it's also a factor of income and of education levels that those people are not really using it. Yeah.
Okay, so are there any further questions from the audience regarding Rüdiger's talk? Okay, so if not, then yeah, I would say thank you so much. So my impression is that so I was thinking about a question that covers all the presentations, and what pops up in my mind is when we talk about automation, and maybe that fits somehow also to Rüdiger's talk. Is it always thinking about a substitute to blue collar workers, or could be complementary stuff? So there's a huge debate now in the academia that we, on the one hand, we're maybe a little bit too pessimistic.
A short-term consequence as we shift, or is that really just going to be the nature of work, and we're going to have to think about other policies that can combat that these kind of jobs that are here to stay tend to be highly unequally paid?
It's a great question, and thank you for asking it. So I always think about retail banking, and that's one that a lot of economists who have studied technology and automation have looked at. And when the ATMs were introduced, it didn't do away with jobs in retail banking. Instead, it actually led to an explosive growth in jobs in that sector because it enabled banks to actually move into new regions. And so in my view, I don't think that's a case that suggests that there's technological determinism here. I think it's about the kinds of industry growth strategies, the kinds of organizational strategies that are being adopted. And, you know, for me, as someone who's studied manufacturing probably most in depth around this question, in the US context, I am really hopeful by the fact that there's been this incredible new research coming out of the Upjohn Institute. Sue Hausman, who's an economist there, has actually identified lower than originally estimated productivity in US manufacturing. And the reason why is because the way that we've calculated productivity over the last 20, 30 years, we have kind of assumed quantity gains when it's actually quality gains. And so the way that economists calculate productivity, they've built in the assumption that we're producing more when actually what we're doing is speeding up the quality of some of these products. And so what she's done is basically strip the productivity measures from or stripped computers and electronics out of that. And when you do that, US productivity has not just stagnated in some industries, it's pretty much taken a nosedive. And I take that as a sign that actually we have a lot more opportunity to be investing in technologies and innovation. And if we do it in a way that sort of tightly couples some of these workforce development strategies I mentioned, instead of assuming that the jobs will go away, then I think we actually have a moment where we are poised for growth and where we can use automation and innovation to expand job opportunities. So, you know, I'm not an economist, which means I get to be a little more optimistic as a planner, but, you know, that is my hope going forward. And I think Tuesday's election will be a huge part in determining whether we have a return to an Obama-like administration with the manufacturing.
I don't think that's, I mean, I think people who are saying that they're barking up the wrong tree, but the implications on the distribution, that really is where the problem is.
So the question is our policy toolbox we have now, we're talking about maybe subsidizing households with low educational level. Is that enough to help those people to make it to better jobs, or do we need new other policy instruments to help those people in the income?
Large parts which are not pulling their weight, basically. I mean, I mean, if you have, you know, a large number of those places, I mean, you have a major impact on the productivity of your country. It's not, you know, it's not just kind of like that's a localized, isolated problem, but it will weigh down your whole country.
Thank you. So Nicola, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really appreciate this idea of thinking about place. I also think there's value to thinking about kind of industry and sector. So how do you act in a way that is looking at what's happening within a particular industry within a particular place? Because we know from economic geography that industries can be structured very differently in very different places. And I think that speaks to this opportunity to think about, again, how to push some of these strategies into this dispersed economic development system that we have, at least in the United States. Fred Block and Andrew Schrank have this really nice concept of the decentered developmental state, and that's especially true in economic development and related to innovation and manufacturing extension, et cetera. And so figuring out ways to sort of go through these industry or sector institutions, and then pushing that framework within our educational institutions. So I've done a lot of work in North Carolina on biotechnology. I've worked with Marianne on this, and then my kind of interest in this initially was not just on the entrepreneurial side, but on that effort to pull down the career ladder through these intentional economic and workforce development coordinated strategies in biomanufacturing. And this has been very localized in the sense that it's been enacted at the community college level. But what the state has done has created this sort of partnership across different localities and regions in North Carolina. They've created an umbrella organization that helps to, you know, move information about what is happening in these very specific localities and really start to scale this and coordinate in this in a way that can be more effective. And what's really cool about these systems is that when you get them started, you know, they've had deep investments from the state government, deep investments from the local community. And when they hit a crisis moment, as this system did during the Great Recession, when the pharmaceutical industry went through consolidations and couldn't provide those jobs anymore, this whole system pivoted to food processing, natural products, and my favorite, craft brewing.
Happen in the future. So not just about employment, but thinking about it in a time length as well, and the skill upgrading to prepare workers now and in the future.
So is it the case that we should maybe focus more on the transitional dynamics in our also theoretical models on new economic geography or growth? Maybe you're talking about the transitional dynamics, which is from particular importance, and so maybe should we rethink our theoretical model framework? We have COVID-19, we have this maybe de-agglomeration tendency from New York back to the rural areas. So is this a chance also for theoretical
up to have at the national level, and they have different things that are playing, that are acting in, that are pushing the inequality higher at the regional level than at the national level.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to pretend I can come up with a good economics model. But I think the concept of transition is a really important one. And if we can find ways to model, you know, what that transition might look like. So I've, speaking of transitions, I've started a new project with a long-term collaborator of mine, Natasha Iskander, looking at climate change and work. And we realized that the real threats to employment, you know, we may be talking about automation, but it is climate change. That is going to be, I think, in our lifetime, the major displacing effect on employment. We, in this state, for example, in only a few years from now, they are predicting that the entire growing season will be 90 degrees Fahrenheit or more daily. That has huge implications for heat stroke and the pressures on the human body of agricultural workers. It is going to transform the way that we think about that work. And so I think if we can be using kind of new approaches to start to kind of think about what those changes might look like, and then use those models to start to think about what we need to be doing now, right, with those kinds of transformations that are on the horizon. I'm been doing a lot of reading, and there's actually a Swedish labor organizer who's focused on work in the environment, who's doing really interesting stuff around this concept of transition. And he's brought an example from World War II, when a plane manufacturer that was used for the military had to be decommissioned. And in that case, the Lucas plan was to actually take the knowledge of frontline workers, that knowledge of supply chains, of production processes, of manufacturing processes, et cetera, and have them be a critical part of that transition process. And unfortunately, their proposal was never adopted, and there are reasons why that we don't have to get into, but I think it's an example of what happens when we start to model these changes, right? And then we start to think about institutional actions with